floor is yours. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Maria. Hello, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I officially despair to welcome you to the century where we reap the fruit of all that we have sown in the last couple of centuries. By the end of this discussion and talk, I hope you're going to walk away understanding a bit more about the motivations and the underlying philosophy of Extinction Rebellion, XR. It will be impossible to do it justice in the time frame. I've got 25 minutes. I typically talk for a couple of hours about this, so we'll see how far we can get. But I have also been asked to show you the contrast between how XR works and what it does, as opposed to classical campaign organizations. And I will use Greenpeace as your classic case study to see how we are different. Earlier this year in 2022, Antonio Guterres said, the UN Secretary General, that nearly half of humanity is living in the danger zone now. Many ecosystems are at the point of no return now. Unchecked, carbon pollution is forcing the world's most vulnerable on a frog march to destruction now. So this is not XR speaking. This is the most mainstream leader on the planet. He's the UN Secretary General. All this stuff now is so uncontroversial. It is science, it is fact. This is the century of too much heat, of not enough water, as well as too much water at the same time. It's what we climate scientists call chaotic water regimes. It's not just global warming, it's global weirding, it's global heating. And I think because most of you in this room will probably be still alive in the year 2100, which is the date to which all the projections go, and it's a funny little thing because they make it sound like that's where the end of history is, whereas we know that there are further generations down the line. My children will live to see that date, as will you and yours. So I think we can agree that history does not end there, and we would be well advised to think in a longer term than that, even while politicians are struggling to think beyond tomorrow, or at least the electoral cycle of just a couple of years, 2-3 years. If you want to find out more about what your future might look like, I would encourage you to read a couple of books which were written in the long past, and they're what I would call social science fiction. And one of them is, the book is called A Canticle for Leibowitz. I'll let you have the references after this. By a guy called Walter M. Miller Jr., Canticle for Leibowitz. This was written in 1959, but also another book by Isaac Asimov, Caves of Steel, which is part of a quintet of books, but it's the first one, is also fantastically prescient about what the future might hold and what it might look like for human quality of life, and lack of quality of life. But let's look ahead for a bit, and let's talk about how the people of XR are trying to turn spaceship Earth away from such a dystopian future. And the pictures that you see here, this is not the future. This is what the present day looks like. And droughts, wildfires, floods, and sea level rise are already here today. We're 1.2 degrees beyond pre-industrial average levels of temperature on the surface of the planet. And about a third of the population, the human population, are already living under a 1.5 regime or higher. So I want to give you quickly a couple of points about Extinction Rebellion. I'm aware that you've read the book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. You've read the article about the New Kids on the Block. I read them too. I was a bit disappointed at the end of How to Blow Up a Pipeline because I never found out how to blow up a pipeline. But anyway, and I really wanted to know how to do that, but I didn't get to find out. Anyways, so about Extinction Rebellion then, and every single word on this slide is important because we are non-violent, and this is really critically important. And I want to start with a definition of what violence is. Violence is against living creatures. You could call them animals, humans, but we do not consider property damage to be violence. And that's a very important distinction to make, as you will see later. And so we are a non-violent, direct action, civil resistance movement. We are not a charity, we're not a company, we are a movement. We don't even have an incorporated legal entity. And we are here because we have recognized that individual action is going to be insufficient to tackle these dual crises of climate and ecological crisis, and that we need to force governments, international organizations such as the UN and UNFCCC, such as the EU, and global corporations everywhere around the globe to... oh my God, that's a familiar face coming onto the Zoom. I'm very surprised. Haha, Michael. Anyways, here we are. And so our job at Extinction Rebellion is to go beyond the individual, each of us, and to force governments, international organizations, and corporations to take the action that we require them to do on our behalf. Most of global emissions are emitted on our behalf. We don't do it. And so we don't have a direct impact over how that gets handled, which is why Extinction Rebellion is here. We are nonviolent because it makes sense, both from a social science perspective. It is clear from the science that nonviolent resistance movements are more successful than violent ones. And also, it's the ethically right thing to do. We are not violent people. I'm just a researcher trying to make ends meet, trying to raise my children, and I'm not inherently likely to pick up arms, weapons to fight. I'm much more likely to go on a protest and sit down. And the reason why we're here is because we realized that nothing has worked. I'm going to show you a little line chart in a minute, which is a part of what we call the hockey stick graph. You may be familiar with this. It's a graph that has been developed by a team of scientists in Pennsylvania. Michael Mann, the famous paleoclimatologist, about the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere in the past couple of thousand years. I'm only going to show you the last couple of 100 years where after the Industrial Revolution, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere started skyrocketing exponentially. And it went from about 280 parts per million to about 420 today. And in relation to that, we can also see that's the red line. And next to it is the squiggly blue line, which shows temperature records from 1850 onwards, and showing how pre-industrial average temperatures went from that 0 level to 1.2 above that level today. And you can see how closely matched these two lines are. That's because there is no other real reason for the temperatures to go up other than what we call CO2 equivalents. So it's CO2 as well as other greenhouse causing gases. And you can see that nothing's worked because of all the things that have happened in this time frame. Greenpeace is a 50-year-old organization. Friends of the Earth is similar. The Sierra Club is 100 years old, and a lot of other campaign organizations besides, WWF as well. We've had the UNFCCC and the COP process. 27 COP conferences have not dented this curve. This exponential curve keeps on going up and up and up. In the UK here, where I dial in from, we have the Climate Change Act since 2008, didn't make a dent. The Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, COP26, COP27, which has just concluded. All of these things have not made a dent. We're also experiencing climate litigation. So you may or may not be aware, but in about 30 countries, there's 1,300 lawsuits either going through the courts or having concluded, where individuals and organizations are suing their countries on the subject of climate change and global warming. And all of these things have caused this graph to look the way it does. And so anytime that anybody, a politician or anyone else, tells you that we're making progress, that we're taking action, bless you, taking action, just look at this graph. If this graph keeps on going up, then any action that we're taking is not having the effect that it requires. Net zero, to be clear, is if this red line goes flat. If it's completely flat, that's net zero, and if it starts going down, then it's net negative, so we're drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere. It's not going to happen in our lifetimes, that's for sure. Since the IPCC formed 1988, we have emitted more CO2 knowingly than all of our previous emissions in history. So we have known, the science has been clear for 30, 40 years. The greenhouse effect has been known for 150 years. And yet, here we are at this point, and nothing has worked. And you know, the warming of the planet will only stop when we stop carbon dioxide and equivalents. And we have seen that the system that we live in does not enable that to stop or even to slow down. So, you know, playing around the edges is not going to work, tinkering around. If everybody did a little bit, that would amount to a little bit. Everybody needs to do everything. That pertains to individuals as well, of course, but we need the right incentives and we need the right structures around us. We need the right choice architecture in order to be able to do this. And I personally, and this isn't the view of Extinction Rebellion generally, although it might be, but this is certainly my view. I'm a CO2 purist, and I'm a supply side purist. And what that means is I believe that we cannot reform the system from the demand side. No matter how much we reduce our demand for energy, our demand for fossil fuels, it's not going to work, because as long as people bring up fossil fuels from under the ground, that material will get used in some way, at some stage, at some price by somebody. So it's only the supply side. If you change the supply side, that's where real savings can be made. And who are the people that can change the supply side? Are corporations that supply us with oil and gas, are they going to do that? Are they going to voluntarily change that and stop producing it? No, it's a gold mine for them. So it's really only governments and international organizations that can agree to stop it. And that's why Extinction Rebellion is so focused on governmental action, because they are, you know, the incentives that are being offered to fossil fuel companies to produce or not to produce is going to make the difference. Have a think about why business as usual is not an option. Just how big the change needs to be for net zero. Think about what net zero might look like. You know, think about transport. All the cars, all the lorries, the trucks, all the shipping, all the flights, energy generation, homes, manufacturing, heavy industry, all of these things need to change completely. And that's a massive societal overhaul. And we know we have a model now, and we know that it can work, because in the years of COVID, we suddenly found trillions of dollars to invest in COVID protection and in COVID vaccines. And that's the kind of level of wartime mobilization that we need to do in order to get to the level that we need. Just as a thought, bear in mind that when in 2020 everything stopped, right? All the flights were down, all the cars were parked, all the industry was down. And in that year, carbon emissions reduced by about 6 or 7% compared to the previous year. That doesn't mean that carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere reduced. No, it's quite the opposite. It means that they still increased by 97% or 93 or 94% on top of the previous year. So it's that is a drop in the ocean. We would need to do that and more than that every single year to get to net zero for about 10-15 years in a row. And we've done it once by accident and never again. And so for that reason, because we need this systemic change, it's quite clear what Extinction Rebellion demands. These are our 3 demands. They sometimes change a little bit in terms of wording, but the content is really pretty much the same. The first point is we need to tell the truth. Everybody, all institutions, including government, media, and corporations, must tell the truth to start with about the situation we're in. The kind of communication where COVID was on the headlines every single day, that's exactly what we need for climate change as well. That's not an easy one. But the second one is what I call the impossible demand. It's to have net zero emissions by 2025, and of course to start to protect and repair nature. But it's the net zero by 2025, which is quite impossible. However, Extinction Rebellion doesn't work on what is possible. We work on what is necessary. And if you think about the developed world, they will need to reduce faster in the name of both environmental justice, but also because of their ability to do so and their financial situation. So that the rest of the world that wouldn't apply to, but certainly the developed world would have to be 2025. And we've been saying this for 4 years now. Nothing's changed. We will continue to say this, and when 2025 comes by, I will continue to say 2025 is the last date we can be carbon neutral in the Western world if we want to keep 1.5 alive. And in fact, on that point, 1.5 is well and truly dead, and anybody who says otherwise is lying to you. Oh, sorry, the third demand, very importantly, is deciding together. And we have recognized, and I'll come to talk about this in a second, of how representative democracy doesn't represent us and it doesn't really work. And so there's a second layer, a citizens' assembly layer, and you can read about this at length, so I'm not going to go into detail, can help by nominating members of society to come up with a plan for what needs to be done, which will then have legal ramifications on governments to implement it. We know that governments find it really difficult to implement long-term plans, and they're also finding it really difficult to implement unpopular policies. Now, climate change is going to be uncomfortable. As one of my friends likes to say, there is no non-radical future. Every future is radical. It could be radically shit, or it could be radically good, but it depends on us pretty much right now of how we make that happen. And so deciding together and implementing an additional layer of democracy to be able to make these uncomfortable decisions is really necessary in the absence of politicians willing to make those choices. And as I said, I'm a CO2 purist. And if we do nothing else, we must stop fossil fuels from being extracted and used. And I want you to walk away from today with just 3 words. If you remember nothing else from what we talk about here today, I want you to remember these 3 words. We need to do this rapidly, entirely, and forever. Rapidly, entirely, and forever. If we don't do this, if we don't stop CO2, we will fail, because everything else we do doesn't matter. Everything else matters a great deal if we do the CO2 bit, but if we don't do CO2, we are screwed. It's simple. It is that simple. And that's exactly what XR is here to do. And in fact, we have an immediate demand on top of the 3 demands, which I've just shown you, which is stopping and ending fossil fuels. And more specifically, no more fossil fuel subsidies, no more new fossil fuel extraction licenses, no more new fossil fuel infrastructure. We have all the infrastructure currently in existence today to well overshoot the 2-degree warming that is the absolute final frontier. We don't need to build anything more in order to do that. So building any new infrastructure is flying in the face of humanity's survival. Now, Extinction Rebellion has a theory of why that problem is what it is, and I've already alluded to that somewhat. But it's 3 points, and I'll go through it really quickly. The first point is about representative democracy. It's a little bit not the politicians' fault, the fact that they have these short-term election cycles, and they physically cannot think 10 to 20 years ahead. So they end up kicking the can down the road and hope somebody else will solve the problem later on. Unfortunately for us, climate change is not something you can solve later. You either solve it now, well, ideally 40 years ago, but the second best time is now, or it's not going to get solved. It's just going to break the system. And the second point is this obsession with growth, of economic growth, and GDP being the main marker of human development, which is completely wrong, because this kind of capitalism, this extractive neoliberalist capitalism, assumes that there's an endless source of raw materials such as clean air, clean water, fertile soil, minerals, and all the rest of it. And then there's also an endless sink to dispose of the waste and of the pollution. But you can see that pollution and waste doesn't go away. It stays with us on the surface, in the atmosphere. The picture that you see here is the Ogoniland oil spill in the Niger River Delta in Nigeria, and caused by Royal Dutch Shell. They have been awarded damages 11 years ago. There was a cleanup ordered, and they were awarded, I think, $1 billion to clean up the land. They've never seen the money, and the land is as it is today. So they can get away with it. They're going to carry on doing it and just dig for more GDP-valued growth and cash and profits. And the last reason for why we're here is actually the combination of the first 2. So politicians are very much influenced by the the big oil players, and global justice has been sacrificed, as we have seen, for the sake of this tiny minority. And just to give you an idea of budgets, the top 5 oil producers spent $200 million on lobbying for delaying carbon reduction. and I'll talk about XR in a second, but we raise in the UK about £1 million a year. So they outspend us by a couple of orders of magnitude, and it's a bit surprising that we're getting any cut through at all. And the end result of that is this complete mismatch of climate injustice in the world. What you see on this map is the distribution of historic carbon emissions. So you can see the US, Europe, and Japan are disproportionately large. China, India coming up the curve, South America, Africa, tiny little specks down south. This is the distribution of CO2 emissions historically. And on the next slide, you can see the distribution of climate impacts that are going to happen in the future. And you can see that the biggest emitters, historic emitters, Europe and US, have the smallest amount of climate impact. And it's no surprise that they're not in a great hurry to make change, because they don't have to care. It's Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia that will bear the brunt of the climate impacts. My thesis was on climate migration. So actually my belief firmly is that climate change is less likely to cause the destruction of human societies in the global north, and it's much more likely to be climate migration, because we don't get the effect of climate change as much as everywhere else does, and there will be up to 1 billion people moving in a completely unprecedented human movement on the planet, which I would argue has the great potential to break society as we know it. Now, as you can imagine, we don't just have a theory of what went wrong. We also have a theory of change, of how we might achieve change. And I've just got a couple of slides on that. And this we're coming into the point about how XR differs from previous groups, such as Greenpeace. But XR is actually very similar to other types of groups. So we walk in the footsteps of other nonviolent civil disobedience or civil resistance movements, such as the Indian independence movement, of women's suffrage, the abolition movement, the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ movement, the anti-apartheid movement. And all of these, what's common about these movements is that they all encountered a lot of resistance until suddenly they reached the tipping point where positive change became inevitable or unavoidable. I mean, nobody would dispute that women should have the vote today. Back then they were criminals. Nobody disputes that black people should have the same exact rights as white people do. Back then it was very controversial. Now it's not. And the same sort of fate awaits the climate movement as well. We might be looked at as disruptive and uncooperative today, but we will be seen as on the right side of history in the future. So how do we build such a direct action group or campaign? Firstly, we talked about nonviolence. We have evidence to believe that nonviolent resistance has a higher chance of success. It's morally right. And it also enables us to build a larger movement, because people are more likely to be willing to join. And a large movement is really, really important. Basically, there's a few reasons why that is. First of all, you want to represent society as much as possible, because when society looks at you, if they see you as someone like them, they're more likely to support the cause. Also, it creates a wider variety of skills and capabilities in the movement, which is really important. We have about 200 different roles within Extinction Rebellion, and each need to be filled. And of course, the larger the movement, the more likely it is to have impact on wider society and politicians. Now, it is really important that we do also create disruption, serious disruption, lasting disruption. There's 2 points there. One is creating publicity and moving public opinion, which is really important because politicians listen to public opinion. And it's very easy to go on a march and go home and vent your anger, and that's it. And it's very easy to ignore those marches. So disruption has to put a pressure on the government. We have to break unjust laws, and we have to be on the right side of history, not the right side of the law. Quietly leafleting, quietly writing to our members of parliament hasn't worked. Everything else that we've tried so far hasn't worked. So instead of just temporary heartwarming measures, we want roadblocks, we want boycotts, we want strike action, hunger strikes, generating publicity, but also putting pressure on governments. And it works. There's historical evidence that it works, and we are pursuing this tipping point where we are unavoidably making changes to the system. That's it. I want to go on to Greenpeace and XR, and I am aware that I'm running short on time. Maria, am I okay for another 5 minutes?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe I feel that if you go over those 5 minutes, it's fine too.
Okay, thank you. Well, this is up to now. I've said things that I normally say on a talk like this in a very, very condensed format, but I want to show you some differences between Greenpeace and XR. And to start with, this morning I was wearing a Greenpeace t-shirt randomly, and I'm a supporter of Greenpeace, and I don't want to talk them down in any way. So everything that I tell you today is not in the spirit of poo-pooing Greenpeace at all. I like what they do. I think they have a place, and I think Extinction Rebellion has a place as well. So let's first of all, and they're clearly different places, which is in a way good because they're complementary of each other. So Extinction Rebellion is a global movement. It's 4 years old now. It's active in 85 countries. We've got 1,178 local groups globally, and over 400 groups in the UK alone, with every town and city has an XR branch. Our budget is really modest. It's about £1 million a year in the UK and another $1 million globally. UK is the biggest. We have about 15,000 active rebels in the UK, which means, up to 10 to 15,000 people show up on a protest on the streets in London or elsewhere. But we do also have about 100,000 supporters in the UK, and nobody really knows how many we have globally, but the guesstimate is about 250,000 people globally support us and show up on one or more protests. Bearing those figures in mind, I'm just going to show you the same for Greenpeace. So Greenpeace is over 50 years old. It's active in 55 countries. Its budget is 237 million euros, and it has 15,000 volunteers across the globe. So that leads me to a couple of conclusions, which I will come to in a minute. But I want to show you a very important difference between Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion first. Greenpeace campaigns and has campaigned, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so, but they campaign on specific issues. So they will take an issue and work around that. Climate change broadly is one of them, but they'll look at deforestation. They had a very successful participation in the Montreal Protocol, phasing out CFCs. But they look at the seas, anti-whaling, overfishing. They look at genetic engineering, nuclear power, toxic waste, deep sea mining. They pick and choose their subject matter, and they go in there and campaign and show up and show resistance to companies that are doing bad things to the environment. Extinction Rebellion, on the other hand, is a mass mobilization movement. It's a completely different thing in that we don't campaign at all on specific issues. We campaign on global justice and various aspects of that. Climate, environmental justice, but north and south, intergenerational. Fridays for Future is an intergenerational justice movement, and we are sister movements. But social justice, racial justice, health justice, economic justice, and climate change, in a way, we are a climate change movement, no question about that. But really, we are here to save the world from itself, and it's a bit of a tall order. But all of these things are very interlinked, and if you fix one of them correctly, like if you fix climate change and climate justice, you will be fixing a whole host of these other things, north-south for sure, social for sure, health for sure, and economic justice as well. And so we don't prescribe solutions. We are here to ask for a better world. We also want to model the world in which we want to live in, and we built the movement around that idea of what kind of world we would like to live in. And so to me, the most standout difference between Greenpeace and XR is how Greenpeace is a professional activist organization. You can see the rainbow warrior there on the left-hand side, and I actually paid for about £10 of that ship when it was being built in 2011. But it was built for $22 million, $22 million, and if Extinction Rebellion were to save all of their funds for 10 years, we might get a ship like that. And that's just one part of Greenpeace's operations. It's a very different thing. Also, it's what I would call exclusive. Very few people make it onto that ship. Anybody can make it onto an Extinction Rebellion protest. With a fresh climate science degree in my pocket, I called Greenpeace in 2016 and I offered up my services. I said, hey, I've just finished my degree. I want to volunteer. I want to do something. And you know what they said? They said, okay, that's great. Hello and welcome. Do you have at the very least 10 hours a week to donate to the cause? And I said, no, I've got 3 kids and I have a full-time job. I can't do 10 hours a week. And they said, thank you very much. Come back, call us back when you have 10 hours at least, because we cannot accept you. And in contrast, Extinction Rebellion will take whatever you have. It ends up being the same. It ends up being quite a lot, but they'll never send you away. We want everybody and we want every part of everybody. And if you show up on 1 protest a year, we'll take that. And if you want a full-time job with XR, we'll take that too. And that leads to this completely different attitude. We want large groups doing joint actions, whereas Greenpeace wants a small exclusive team parachuting, or a small exclusive team attacking an oil rig, or a small team on a boat like this going after the whalers in Japan. It's very visible, it's very exciting, but we found that 50 years of doing this had not really made a dent, for example, in the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Now, another difference is that it's very easy to like Greenpeace because they don't disrupt your life. They disrupt somebody else. They disrupt a whaler. Nobody's on a whaler. We're just watching them do it. It's fun. Whereas Extinction Rebellion can be really disruptive of everyday people's lives. And therefore, we are not necessarily popular. But what we do like to say is we're not here to be liked. We are here to make change. And in fact, it's very interesting. There is evidence to suggest that just because somebody doesn't support the protesters or their tools that they use, that does not necessarily have an impact on the support for the demands that they're making. So there's a separation here. The protester disliked, their demands accepted, understood, and supported. Protest has a very important role in setting the agenda. It doesn't necessarily change people's minds, but what it does do is it influences what they think about. There's a good example with, I don't know if you're familiar with the protest movement which came out of Extinction Rebellion called Insulate Britain. And they basically went ahead and occupied the ring road around London. Highly disruptive, super unpopular, like they were hated. But the media was full of it for weeks. And lo and behold, suddenly there's evidence that home insulation has risen up the policy agenda. The protesters were super unpopular, but they were right in terms of what they wanted, and people agreed with it. And lastly, my very last slide is to show you where Extinction Rebellion and Greenpeace really do come together. This is where we both agree that we have to do direct action. We can't just sit and be armchair activists. We have to take direct action, and we have to accept the consequences. About 1 in 30 people in XR are what we call arrestables, and they get arrested regularly. So do Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain, both of which I would argue are the more extreme position within the XR movement. And some people are in prison right now for what they believe. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I should probably show you this slide, which is a favorite of mine, but I don't need to talk about it at all.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Boris. So we still maybe open now for questions and comments. So who wants to break the ice? Elsa?
Yes, thank you very much for talking to us. My first question is on your last point. You described some more